So yeah, Martin and I always work together, so we thought we might as well try and do this together as well. If it's only 20 minutes, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, mic on? Yeah. Well, as Bolle said, we collaborate in all our work, and we have our office in Stockholm. We are born and raised in Stockholm, and we're sort of locally centered here. And we will try to make this 20-minute speech about our life up until now. So it will be condensed, and we have plenty of images. This is me in the Eero Aarnio rounded chair, lounging, and Bolle is over there having his sort of first meal of the day, perhaps. And this time of period, we're trying to describe what kind of period we lived in, or were raised and born in the 70s especially. And this was the era or the narrative where Swedes were describing Sweden as the perfect country, more or less. We were prosperous, and we have earned a lot after the Second World War, and we were sort of self-happy, so to say. We have Björn Borg, and we have Ingmar Stenmark and Ronnie Pettersson, and they were up on the main scene. And we had politicians that were on the international scene as well. And I think that sort of narrative of having Sweden as one of the best countries in the world affected us quite a lot without really knowing. It will later on change, of course, but that was the 70s for us.
And as a very progressive nation and a city, Stockholm was redeveloped, and this was also, I mean, as you can see, this is in 68, and it's basically in the center there. You have the site of this building that we're standing in, and obviously, if you're just 5 years old or 7 years old, it's not something that you consciously understand or recognize, but it's part of it, and we have sort of very early memories of passing these enormous projects that were going on in the city. And some kind of a general optimism, as Martin described, that was going on. Safe and secure, you could sort of summarize those years. And it was also sort of the last decade of the late modern era in Sweden. So, as you might know, the Million Housing Project was running, and some of these characters were still alive, perhaps working on their last projects, and only 10 years later it was more or less none of them was still around.
So coming back to me and Bolle, we grew up during this sort of prosperous time, and we will try to describe our first sort of relations to architecture, sort of. And for me, it was I stayed every summer 10 weeks at my summer house in the outskirts of the Stockholm archipelago. I'm sitting there with my father, who was also an architect. He designed and actually built this small cottage, and we stayed there for plenty of time. And it was a super off-grid house. We didn't have electricity in the first years, never running water, but it was a pristine and super sort of precious time to stay there, in contrast to the sort of city where we lived during the rest of the years. And I think this created some sort of relation to being close to nature, the water. We were sailing quite a lot, and we spent a lot of time here. And this sort of awareness of nature and how architecture can relate to that was a starting point for me. But during the rest of the year, we lived in the city center, in one of those sort of European perimeter blocks from the turn of the century, and well, it's a sort of rigid grid it's based on, and it's kind of similar to all the older European cities. And one thing that I realized later on was that when I was around 8, 10, something like that, it was a safe city to be in. I could run around the streets with my friends, and all the porches and doors were open, so we were able to access the courtyards, and we could make shortcuts through a block, and we could experience the courtyards, and that's like 30% of a city. And that was something that was super exciting to just experience and explore, and that is of course a result of a safe community where you don't need to lock the doors. Later on, there were code locks everywhere. All the courtyards were being private and not accessible, and the city grew smaller. You were allowed to walk the streets but not access the courtyards and so on. And it sort of refers to the Nolli map of Rome, where you have another sort of mapping or reading of the city, where you have all the civic places in white and the private parts in black. And that doesn't take into account if you're inside or outside either a courtyard or a building, which is a sort of interesting way of just interpreting a city and in relation to safetiness.
Yeah, and this is my grandfather. He was also an architect. I never met him though, because he passed away when he was about 50 years old. But he was missed and became this mythical person a bit in the family, because he had a good run as an architect and did a city hall and several other buildings, some of them quite close to here, as part of the first redevelopment phase of Stockholm City. But also this house on the west coast, and a bit like Martin's house, it was sort of a building that is nestled into the nature, and sort of, you would use the courtyard to move around, so it would be very small cabins to sleep in, etc. So it's kind of celebrating simple life, and I didn't know that then, of course, but this is where we spent a lot of the summers, and more later I evidently understood sort of the both the formal qualities, but also sort of the ease that he managed to put this house on a cliff where that nobody else wanted, basically, on this island. When my father was born, and when he was 10 years old, my grandfather told him that he was going to be an architect, and he told his brother that he was going to be an engineer. So that was kind of strange. He somehow saw in these kids that they should have different careers. And later his brother actually became an architect as well, because he changed. But this, of course, made me think that I would not be an architect. It would be such a sort of unindependent choice to make in that family. Well, that went on. I wanted to be a football player until I was 18 or 19 or something like that. And the image to the right, though, was a result because my father and mother got a scholarship to spend 1 year in Rome at the Swedish Institute to do some studies on mountain cities. So they took the family, and this image is slightly later, because we came back every year, every second year for a long time, and that, of course, created some memories. And my favorite building was this one, the Castel Sant'Angelo, where there was a very exciting tunnel-like ramp inside the structure. And of course, also part of it was a military museum. So for a young kid, it was kind of exciting on many levels. And the sort of notion of all of these spaces that you would see didn't mean much at the time, of course, but it was exciting. And later, when we started traveling on our own, with the I came back at perhaps the age of 18 or 20 or something, and that was, I think, the first time I consciously remember that I stood in a space and I was kind of overwhelmed, and just by the sheer sort of imagination of the persons that created this, and the size of things, just sort of recognizing the effort to create spaces like these.
And me being a teenager, haven't traveled that much up until interrailing came. It was the heydays of interrailing, where you could buy a ticket for not that much money, be on the tracks for a month, and travel Europe wherever you wanted. And more or less everybody did that, and that was a great experience for me. Together with my friends, I went every summer interrailing and sort of made grand tours every summer, exploring the whole of Europe more or less. And that was a quite short time span where this was possible. But for me, it was sort of changing and opened up plenty of possibilities, and you saw different cultures, cities, buildings, and I think that also created an interest in architecture for me. And this is me in my 19, 20 something, trying to figure out what to do, and ended up in studying different things closely linked to architecture. So I went to the university to study art history. I went to BASIS, a small art school, like a prep school for then the School of Arts and Crafts, the Konstfack, where I stayed a couple of years. And that was sort of closely linked to architecture, but not really architecture. And I during that period, I felt that it was important to sort of reach out to the real stuff. But during the time, I was really interested into this sort of these sculptures that, or sculptors or artists that were closely linked to architecture. They dealt with space, representation of the city or a building, or creating a relation to nature somehow. And I think I had this sort of approach when I started the architectural school, to have some sort of artistic approach towards architecture somehow.
And so, yeah, from my side, then I spent some time as a teacher, and working in restaurants and traveling, and then eventually I decided I had to sort of concede and realize that architecture was basically what interested me, and sort of this all the different things. I mean, if you can't choose a very specific part of I don't know, of science or something else, or liberal arts, architecture is a good thing because it sort of really encompasses everything. And this is where Martin and I met, and it was a great time. This school worked really well. It's the old School of Architecture in Stockholm, and we met through common friends, and we arranged parties together. We actually had the best parties in Stockholm with like 1,500 people.
But in the same time, it was sort of the 90s, as this was a great recession, especially when it came to architects. Like if 30 or 40, 50% of all architects were unemployed. It was a sort of a catastrophe. And the interest rates were like 500%. It was crisis. So it was good in studying over those years. But it was a sort of shift we felt when we went to school. Something were happening, something new will come. And but we were still in a very analog time period. We didn't have any cell phones or internet. We had MTV as the sort of youth canal to look at, and that was sort of the first sort of sense of something that is global, where that everybody's watching, and you create this sort of common common thing about it. And music was important for the two of us during this period. The computers, we saw them, we never used them. They were crap. We couldn't use them in our work. We were hand draw everything during our time. But it was sort of on the verge of a shift. And of course, we all know that internet came and computers came and changed us quite a lot. But this was still an analog period for us.
And the result, of course, was that a lot of good architects didn't have work. So they came to the school and taught, and there was a lot of time for thinking and reflection and a lot of theories going on, but very little results coming out, you could say. So what happened was that we, as everybody else, looked elsewhere. And this is just some examples, but as Martin said, it was pre-internet, so you needed to get the books if you wanted to sort of follow what was going on in other parts of the world. And so this combination of some really good Swedish and local teachers and thinkers, and then at the same time seeing almost no results in Stockholm, but a lot of things happening elsewhere, of course opened up for a wish to sort of go somewhere.
And during the 90s, a lot of interesting architects emerged. Here are a few of them. And the constructivism era was in the 90s. All the French philosophers were around, and we weren't that keen in those theories. We sort of gravitated to these guys, and they also had, of course, theories and ideas about the society and architecture and how to do buildings, but they were all doers in that sense, that they built stuff, and we were sort of keen in understanding how to build something, and I think that was one reason why we sort of gravitated to these examples.
And I went for a year to Paris, and just again seeing and sort of experiencing things that happened in real life. And of course the Pompidou happened long before, but it was sort of part of the same tradition of ideas that were realized. And at the same time, being at the center of Europe, you got to see a lot of other things going on. And these are just some examples of, again, something that borders to parts of what we work with as architects, and artists that would both have a very clear idea and almost create like a story of their own, and then also manage to design or to shape both spaces and objects in a very kind of coherent way.
Oh, sorry. Well, I moved, or I got a scholarship at the end of my studies to go to Porto, a remote place in Portugal, and study for César Sotomura. And I also met Tavra, and those three heroes of Porto are kind of important and made a great impression to me. And since they work so locally, more or less all their projects are within a couple of miles radius, I got the chance to study them all, and they also explained the projects for me or for us, and that was a sort of eye opener in thinking of doing something that is not global or somewhere else, but just here and now and local, doing what's possible to do, in this case Porto. And that was a mindset that sort of referred to a local context and how to sort of develop ideas around that.
Yeah, and the contrast between what was going on at the school in Stockholm, where the teachers would basically ask you, what do you want to do? And what was going on in Porto or in Paris, I think was immense, because there the teachers were telling you what to do, and that they had their idea of architecture. But the advantage of that was, of course, that you could revolt and you could sort of create your own position. in relation to those very firm stances. The other thing I think was, of course, the position of the architect in these countries was very different and very inspiring, because when I worked at an office in Paris, those projects were sort of managed by the architects and not by the constructor or a project leader somewhere. So I think all of these things together sort of hinted that there would be a different way of being an architect also in Sweden.
And time flies, so I think we should hurry up a bit. But I went back to Stockholm, started work at Anders Wilhelmsson's place. He was a sort of super important person during the 90s, and well, he still is. But he had a super interesting studio, really small one. We were only 4 people, and created some really interesting projects. But unfortunately, none of them were really built, apart from 1 or 2 or something. But he was like an enfant terrible in the Stockholm or Swedish architectural scene. Did things that was ahead of his time, sort of, and he's really struggled in getting things done. But he was important for me, and perhaps for you also, since you studied for him at the Royal Academy. But he had a sort of bold and pragmatic approach on things, and still very poetic. And I think we took inspiration from him in starting our own office.
Yes, and so to hurry up a little bit, the start was in 1999, and we were a 2-person office, and we never had a plan to be anything else but to try and do projects. Today we are about 30 architects, and just to sum up a few sort of aspects of architecture that we have sort of, let's say, we return to in our work. And the first is the local context, with sort of an extremely direct relation to what is possible, and what is the local resources, the local know-how, and how can you use that, as in this building, to create something that is not only pragmatic but also beautiful.
Sort of, well, the vernacular architecture is super interesting to sort of study, since it sort of derives from what's needed, nothing more than that, really. Another example is Leverance and his way of dealing with materiality, tectonics, the sort of heaviness, the sort of mystique and serenity. That is sort of qualities that we wanted to achieve, but being close to using materials in a very sort of present way. I think we were sort of inspired by him.
Yeah, the craftsmanship. We jumped one there.
Oh, sorry.
And so, and the other sort of fundamental aspect of organization, proportions, and just this spatial flow. These examples are not necessarily the most important ones, but they are very clear in sort of where they come from.
Well, this building is sort of beyond aesthetics, but it's a concept. You slice up pieces of Dutch, and then you stack them on top of each other, and you have a sort of expo pavilion. And we were sort of excited with those sort of bold concepts. It could be an asset in sort of getting beyond the aesthetics, or the sort of common known aesthetics. So even though our work is not that close to MBRDV's, but I think we were definitely inspired and looked a lot at their work.
Yeah, and sort of out of the box thinking. Architecture that could be utopic and on sort of wanting to create new worlds. Also something that, of course, wasn't meant to be built, but still mind-boggling somehow.
And trying to dare to do something apart from what's just in front of you or necessary. Trying to think so out of the box, so to say, and also trying to create something that could be poetic in a way, or we could have that as a goal. Designing a cloud in this case, and also architecture that could be temporary, doesn't have to last. It could be something that is an intervention for a short time period. Well, those aspects, just a few of those, are important for us. Perhaps not for everybody, but for us it's something that we sort of come back to. Not necessarily these projects, but these aspects.
And to conclude, I think we can just say that the scope of architecture is so broad, so that we have never felt possible to be restrained to just one sort of material or one sort of spatial organization or geometry or whatever it is. But there are different ways of doing architecture that it's more like a continuous exploration of possibilities. And I don't know if you want to stop now.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yes.
Thank you a
so
lot.
much. Yeah.
Thank you a lot. If it's already challenging with one life, which must be very difficult. And there is something that I always, when I have watched talks that you have held, I wonder how I also admire how you complement each other, that it flows. And how I imagine that you say, oh, we know each other very well, but how do you do it? Do you need to practice that a lot, or do you kind of have a good feeling?
I think our collaboration is very close. We do all our projects together. We're responsible equally in every project. And so we talk a lot, and we sort of argue a lot, and that's important. But we're sort of on the same page, more or less. So we don't get stuck. And as in for a lecture, we never really prepare that much. We collect all the images, and we have a sort of rough idea what to say, but we never divide it in between us and so on. So and I think perhaps that's something you could learn, or perhaps it's just how we work together.
Let's talk about the bad things. Bolle, what can you not how to say that? What can you not stand of Martin now that he?
Yeah.
I mean, cannot everything will be positive. I mean, right?
I think if you want to collaborate for a very long time, I think you just need to accept that,
cope with each other.
Yeah, and you just need to accept the sort of way it works.
Let him talk. Now, that's good.
No, but I think so, because well, I'm sure Martin has things that I could do better or different. But I think if you start to discuss those issues too much, it would probably be less efficient. But on the other hand, you can also say that you're lucky. I think it's like someone else said before, that like as with the marriage, you have to be lucky. I mean, of course, you have to find a friend or and make a choice somewhere, but then you have to be lucky, because you never know, like 15 years later or 20 years later, if it will still be a good match.
And there's also one thing that when I see you and I listen to you, you're always very calm. Is there something that fires you up? Any kind of passion where you say, okay, I lose my mind when this happens? Maybe Martin, you want to start by that?
I think we can lose our minds when it comes to processes.
Processes?
Yeah, building processes. I think we can be kind of stubborn, and we never give up, so to say. And quite often it's a fight. But I think that's common. It goes for most architects, I think. But I would say that, but within the office, it's sort of a calm place. I think all our employees agree on that. It's a calm and friendly place to be at. But we have our enemies outside.
And Bolle, is something that
No, I
Something
think
different?
No,
I will say football. You will mention football before. Is football something that you get very excited about?
oh, excited about it. Yeah, I mean, I think outside of work, I think we can get excited about many things. Yeah, could be football.
Give me a couple
art.
of examples.
Yeah, football, art, music, skiing.
It's really nice. Actually, because now it's black, the screen, but have also something because it looks like you have a very clear opinion on what architecture is or should be. And I wanted to ask you what you consider is needed in a project to be considered architecture and furthermore good architecture.
Oh, that's tricky to answer without having a sort of example. But well, our way of producing architecture goes from those aspects that we just talked about, and I think if some of those are missing or completely sort of not taken care of, I wouldn't say it would be a successful project. We often look for, if you call it solutions, that solves many things at the same time, take into account several aspects. And that is something how we sort of look for the good solution, so to say, where the solution solves many things at the same time, just a few lines that sort of writes the map.
Well, something that you would like to add to that? Something that you mentioned before about architecture and differences in the process that you mentioned also in an answer before, is that projects were managed in other places by architects so that you kind of be more on it and make sure that everything is in place. Is that something that you consider extremely needed for a successful project to be brought to a good place?
What do you mean with a good place? I'm sure.
That finish for a design to be finalized, because sometimes within the process we might lose control.
Okay, yeah.
If there is something, if this managing of the architect in the whole process is something you consider key.
Yeah, I'm not sure but I think, we always follow all the projects all the way. So we never do projects where we sort of leave it to the builders or the clients to finish it without us. So I don't know if that's the answer to your question, but it's definitely part of our philosophy since the start. And we only accept projects where we can do that. And I think we touched it, even if it was very short. But since the process often is different, the setup of the process, at least in this part of the world, as an architect, you will need to sort of either choose your projects or sort of fight yourself into that position. And that's what inspired me a lot when I was in Paris, because there it was like 50 years back in Sweden, I think, where you would be in charge of many parts of the process. And we actually have one project right now where we are in charge of all the consultants, so not only the architecture, and that means a lot, because we can coordinate in a completely different way and manage the projects.
So that's the ideal, I guess, for your ideal for a project.
Could be, yeah. It's it always comes with responsibility. So it depends on how comfortable you want to be.
And with your list of remarkable projects, with these kind of practices, I always wonder. There was a project that you see it now and you think, we better don't show it. We put it I don't know. So we hide it. Is there something that you kind of a building that years after you are not proud of?
I would say that we put a lot of energy into all our projects. So therefore, I think we all sort of love them in different ways. But losing control during the building process could make this sort of cherished project less lovable, so to say. But I think we've been fortunate, and we've been also quite thorough in do our sort of due diligence when it comes to a client. Because it's a match. We have to have good clients and have to have good building contractors to make a good project. But if some of those are missing or failing, it might be such a project. But we don't have that many, but a few.
And one very last one for Bolle. Is there something that, from the professional part, not the personal part, but something that worries you a lot and keeps you awake at night, that you say, this is driving me crazy and there's a lot of problem, and I don't know, there's something, some kind of situations that...
Professional or...
Professional. If it's personal, that we're going to be...
Kids.
Might be too personal, but in the profession.
There was a lot more before. I mean, like 10 or 15 years ago, I think there was a lot more sort of frustration. And somehow either I think I've gotten used to it or we sort of are more clever, more experienced, so that we manage the situations better. So it's very rare these days. It could still happen, of course, but it's very rare.
That's healthy.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah. I would like to extend it. I don't know. I said it was the last one, but Martin, were there something that you wish you have been, something that you wish it would have been mentioned to you as a student or as a young architect, that you had to learn it through experience or through hard experience? I mean, sometimes you are more relaxed, you know how processes are, and can kind of anticipate some problems, but
well, I think you should spend plenty of time in school, not necessarily doing your 5 years or 7 years or what it is, but take a break, do an internship, do something else, study something else, go back, because you will work the rest of your life. So stretch it as much as you can, and sort of pour in as much experience you can possibly find.
That's so actually Interrail, and it must have been amazing for you, like those summers that you had. Thank you a lot for the wonderful talk. Now we're going to have in a couple of minutes the roundtable discussion, but for now, thank you a lot. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot.